Let's make a start. It seems appropriate, perhaps a little ironic, that we've scheduled an event today about the EU 2020 climate targets called Tougher Carbon Targets, Weaker Renewable Target, on Global Wind Day. Anyway, there's been considerable recent discussion about the 2020 package of climate targets at EU level. The European Commissioner has made proposals to increase the emissions target from 20 to 25%. The UK government and a number of other governments are pushing for the target to be increased to 30%. At the same time, Policy Exchange has published a report in May 2020, Hindsight, which argued for the UK to renegotiate the EU renewables target on the basis that it's a hugely and unnecessarily expensive way to meet the 2020 carbon emissions reductions targets, and the focus should instead be on developing a long-term credible carbon price. And we added that a quid pro quo for any increase in the 2020 emissions target should be removing the technological constraints of meeting that target. In other words, the renewables target. We've added today another report, which should be reviewing your seats, called Time for Plan B, and this is authored by Boaz Mazel, who's here on the panel today. And this takes the argument a bit further, arguing that the EU needs to refocus its policy on lowering the costs of climate mitigation at a global level, and makes the case in particular for a greater proportion of resources to be put towards boosting research, development, and demonstration of those technologies with a global potential. Okay, enough plugging about reports. I'm delighted to welcome today three very distinguished speakers. David Kennedy, the Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change, and that committee obviously published their Renewable Energy report last month as well. Tim Yeo, Chairman of the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee, and Boaz Mazel, who is the Director at FTI Consulting and editor of the recently published book, Harnessing Renewable Energy in Electric Power Systems. So I propose that we move straight through three presentations so that there's plenty of time for Q&A before we finish by 2:30 at the latest. So, back to you, David.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. It was only a month ago that we published our Renewable Energy Review. It seems like ages ago, because I think at the same time we were in those discussions about the fourth carbon budget, and okay, we've moved on from there, but I'm going to try and remember what we said and give you the key messages from that report in 10 minutes. So, starting point for our Renewable Energy Review is the Climate Change Act. So we're established under the Climate Change Act that sets the 80% target in primary legislation, and all of the thinking we do about appropriate ambition and means to meet that ambition is around the Climate Change Act and that long-term target. So moving from the 80% target, we showed in the fourth carbon budget report, and we showed that previously in other reports as well, I think there's a general agreement that if you want to decarbonise the economy very significantly, one of the places that you start is to decarbonise the power sector. And if you decarbonise the power sector, then you can extend that clean power generation both to transport through electric vehicles and also to heating through air source or ground source heat pumps. Now, in the fourth carbon budget report, we set out the results of some very detailed modelling which we commissioned POIRI to do about optimal investment strategies under different assumptions about technology costs, carbon prices, and changing demand for electricity from these other sectors in particular, so transport and heat. And what that suggested is, well, we should be aiming to reduce average emissions, so the carbon intensity of power generation, from about 500 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour at the moment to 50 grams or below by 2030. That's not set in stone. We're not saying we should legislate the 50 grams target at the moment, but very deep decarbonisation is something that we should plan for. Now, in the fourth carbon budget report, we didn't try to postulate an appropriate technology mix, so we didn't talk about should it be more nuclear, should it be more renewable, should it be CCS, and that's what we turned our attention to in the Renewable Energy Review, which actually looked at power generation and heat and transport, but I think for the discussion today, the focus is power generation. So just talking through the key things in that report, I think the first message is that if we want to decarbonise the power sector, a huge investment challenge over the next 2 decades, but also beyond that, right out to 2050, then it is appropriate to go into meeting that challenge with a portfolio of low carbon technologies. So renewables alongside nuclear and alongside CCS. And the way that we came to that conclusion or that recommendation was we looked at resource. If you think about the different sets of low carbon technology, well, we've obviously got a load of wind and marine resource in the UK, particularly because we're an island. We have plenty of nuclear resource in the sense we don't expect the uranium supply constraint to become binding anytime soon. Where there may be a constraint is on site availability on the one hand, but also storage capacity as well for nuclear waste. So there may be a resource constraint in those respects. And then if we think about CCS again, well, we're not going to be constrained in how much coal we can buy, we're not going to be constrained in how much gas we can buy for CCS generation, but there may be a constraint on storage capacity, and we may not want to use that available capacity for storing carbon from power generation. May be more useful for industry CCS and the carbon that comes from that. So maybe a binding resource constraint there. If we move on to technical aspects, and so I think the first thing that everybody says when you're talking about wind generation, well, how do you keep the lights on when the wind stops blowing? And the answer is, well, we've got a set of options that can keep the lights on. Those options are demand flexibility, which is facilitated, for example, through smart meters and consumer demand response. We've got storage opportunities, whether that's the traditional opportunities of pump storage, but also increasingly opportunities for using car batteries, for example, as a form of storage. Then there's opportunities for interconnection and exploiting the difference in wind patterns here in the UK and other countries. And finally, well, if you've got that 10-day lull, which everybody worries about, probably you need to revert then to using some balancing unabated gas-fired generation. But that combination of things can keep the lights on. And what we did in our review, or what we got POIRI to do for us, was to create the worst year from the past 10 years in terms of the wind not blowing. So they took the 5-day lull in February 2006, I think it was, and then they took various other low wind periods through other years. They put all of that together, they made a year up, and then they showed how, given that combination of options, we could manage the intermittency. And we could do that at a cost that's not prohibitive. So the cost of the set of those options to manage intermittency is very small relative to the actual generation cost of the various renewables. So wind generation, for example, it doesn't really change the economics of renewable generation. Moving on to the economics, well, obviously at the moment, all of the evidence suggests that nuclear is the lowest cost, low carbon opportunity that we have. There's a great deal of uncertainty over what nuclear costs are, and in particular, construction costs are highly uncertain, but I think if you had to make a bet, if I had to make a bet, well, I would say that for the next decade, possibly for the next 2 decades, nuclear will be the cheapest form of low carbon generation. I think CCS is a promising technology, first of all on gas, and I think increasingly we've begun to think that application to, did I just say gas? First of all, coal is what we've always looked at in the past. I think increasingly we've begun to think, well, the application to gas, so gas CCS may be a much more promising opportunity in the future, but the economics of CCS are highly uncertain at the moment. It doesn't look like CCS will be cheaper than nuclear again for the foreseeable future, but you wouldn't rule that out. And then renewables, well, onshore wind is not that expensive, and our study suggested, well, it was in the range alongside nuclear, for example, which in turn is in the range alongside gas-fired generation, with a carbon price applied to it at the rates and the carbon price underpin announced in the budget recently. So onshore wind not that expensive. Offshore wind, which is an earlier stage technology, is much more expensive, and we were working with a number of about 13, 14 pence a kilowatt hour generation for offshore wind, and you can compare that to maybe 7 or 8 pence for nuclear generation. So at the moment, very expensive. And then if you look at the earlier still technologies, you've got the marine technologies, so the wave and the tidal, and again, at the moment they are much more expensive than the more mature technologies of gas, of nuclear, of onshore wind. But will that change in the future? Well, we looked at very detailed aspects of opportunities for learning in the various components, for example, of an offshore wind project, and certainly for us there are plausible scenarios where offshore wind, whilst it's not competitive at the moment, we envisage the cost can come down over the next 2 decades, possibly even sooner than that, but that it could be competitive as you get to 2030. Same is true for marine, although I think there's a higher degree of uncertainty there. And for solar PV, again, relatively high cost at the moment, but I think there are plausible scenarios where, certainly in other countries, it will quickly become competitive, but even here in the UK, with days like this outside, that it will be competitive in the UK in the 2030s. So, given that combination of things, we asked the question, well, would you like to go into that future where we've got this huge challenge to decarbonise the power sector just with nuclear power generation? And for us, the answer is, well, no, because of the cost uncertainty, because of the limits on site availability and waste storage capacity, and because of public acceptability considerations as well. So what if there's an incident either in the UK or somewhere else in the world and all we've got is nuclear power here? Well, all your eggs are really in one basket in that case. And then we said, well, what about going into the future with both nuclear and CCS as your portfolio? But again, CCS is so highly uncertain, both from a technical but also from an economic perspective, that really does leave you wide open in terms of risk. And so for us, a portfolio which includes a wider range of options, and those renewable options which are promising in the sense that they could potentially compete, and there's good reason to believe they could compete in the future, it is appropriate to develop that portfolio. So if we move on, then we ask the question, well, what are we doing to bring forward those less mature technologies at the moment, and what have we got to support those technologies? It's the renewables obligation going out to 2020. And we asked the question, well, first of all, how much does that cost us? And in particular, how much does the offshore wind aspect of that cost us? So we took Dieter Helm's challenge, and Dieter had said to us, well, stop investing in offshore wind, instead invest in gas-fired generation, and pay the carbon price on the gas-fired generation. And we did that calculation. And what that calculation suggested is that the extra cost associated with investing in offshore wind, in line with the government strategy, and the government strategy is to add about 10 gigawatts over the next decade of offshore wind to the system. So what does that cost us? Well, we estimated per household, so in the residential sector, it's about £50 a household in 2020, and that comes from an underpinning number, which is 2 pence per kilowatt hour. So a bit of a higher percentage increase for those energy intensive users. I'm looking at Jeremy over there, because they are not consuming via the distribution network, so the generation cost there is a bigger proportion of the total cost, but at the household level it's working out to about £50 per household. Now we've said, well, if you didn't have the European renewable energy target, would you aim as part of your technology policy for the level of ambition that the government currently has for offshore wind? And we said, well, strictly no, because you probably don't need to add 10 gigawatts or more of offshore wind generation to the system over the next decade. And let's just point out what the approach is to developing offshore wind. It's ramping up ambition exponentially to 2020, so a massive increase in investment between 2015 and 2020. But then we drop off a cliff, and we don't have any confidence about investment in offshore wind through the 2020s, and that really is not a sensible way to pull through a technology. So we said, well, if you didn't have the renewable energy target in Europe, you probably wouldn't proceed that way. What you'd do is you'd lop off some of the ambition to 2020, and you'd reallocate that through the 2020s to have a much smoother path to bring this technology down the cost curve. And then we say, well, but we have got this renewable energy target at the European level, so we've got to get to a 15% renewable energy share in the UK by 2020, and for us, we took that as a given. We didn't say, well, we should rip that target up, we should go back and renegotiate in Europe. So, given that we've got the target, can we afford to then reduce offshore wind ambition to 2020? We thought, well, maybe we can. There's scope to take 3 gigawatts, 4 gigawatts off that ambition, do more with onshore wind, or buy credits in the renewables market that we expect to see over the next few years, or do more renewable heat, or even possibly biomass power generation, converting those coal plants to biomass that will otherwise be redundant under the European IED. So a set of opportunities to allow us to moderate the offshore wind ambition to 2020. And if you could do that, well, we thought if you can reduce ambition by 3 gigawatts, you can save about £500 million a year for the country, so not insignificant. We said we should keep a flexible approach there. We also said, you know, it cannot be very good for the investment climate, and particularly investments in supply chain development, which you need to bring offshore wind and other technologies down the cost curve. It cannot be good to have nothing said about the 2020s. So if we don't expect offshore wind, for example, to be competitive in the 2020s, well, you cannot then plan that you will invest in a supply chain that you'll have a market to sell to in the 2020s unless there is some kind of support mechanism. So we said, well, reduce the ambition to 2020, but say something about ambition through the 2020s. And the opportunity to say something, it comes through the new electricity market arrangements. We don't know what they will look like at the moment, but if it was the contracts for differences model, you might, for example, set aside some of those contracts for the less mature technologies, subject to certain conditions being met. And we're not saying we should have a blank check to bring these technologies down the cost curve, but if there's evidence that costs are coming down in the way that the industry will tell you the costs will come down over the next years, then we can continue to pull those through, to pull them down the learning curve, and then they will be there for commercial deployment at some point in time, whether it's the late 2020s or early 2030s. So that was one of our key messages, address this lack of confidence for investors around the 2020s. Just to finish off on the electricity market reform. So we did raise some questions there on the electricity market reform, and in particular we said, well, there are some very specific design aspects of the electricity market reform. So if we're going to have contracts for differences, depending on how you index those contracts, you may create unnecessary uncertainty for investors in wind generation, for example. So there are some specific design questions, but I think more importantly at the moment what's happened is we've gone from a situation where investors were very confident with the arrangements in place, so that's the renewables obligation certificates, to one where there's a great deal of uncertainty. So we know the existing arrangements will be phased out, we know there will be something new, whether it will be there within the time frame to support investment decision making that we need to deliver ambition, even moderated ambition to 2020, I think is highly questionable. So what we said in the Renewable Energy Review, and what we will say in our report to Parliament on progress reducing emissions, which we're going to publish in a couple of weeks' time, is very important to have a smooth transition from existing support arrangements to the new electricity market arrangements, and that might mean existing arrangements should be extended in terms of not being phased out in 2013, which is the current plan. So important issues around electricity market reform. But let me just finish with reinforcing those key messages. So under the Climate Change Act, very important for us to get focused on driving down emissions, decarbonising the power system. Meeting that challenge for us, we need a portfolio of options to do that, and it has to be a wider portfolio than just nuclear CCS. It has to pull through what at the moment appear to be promising options as regards renewables. Are we pulling those through with a rational policy at the moment? I've said not really. We can reduce the ambition to 2020 but provide confidence about the 2020s, and then there are very important issues of electricity market reform if we are to avoid an investment hiatus in the renewable sector, which will be problematic given the need to get the investment to develop the portfolio to bring those renewables down the cost curve. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, David. Because I have some slides which should follow. Yeah, thank you. Which I now realise that David and Tim won't be able to see, so we'll do it. Oh, you can? Right, I will stand back. Anyway, I will use the slides all the same. And actually, let's see, you can't really see them. Let me just begin with some context. So we're here in principle to talk about the 2020 targets. So starting with what I guess is common ground, something we all know. If we want to limit global warming to around 2 degrees centigrade, then we have to reduce global emissions very rapidly, very quickly, and they have to peak around 2020. So what I have here are numbers from the IEA. The top line is where we will be under a sort of business as usual scenario, and that sees us heading towards 6 degrees warming, which is potentially very, very dangerous. And the blue line, what they call the 450 scenario, is something which is an emissions scenario which would bring the world to a limit of 2 degrees warming, which is closer to being safe. What is the EU and what is the UK doing about this? Well, we have over the last 20 odd years led the way internationally in trying to get a binding, comprehensive global agreement that would achieve that kind of emissions reduction. The way I characterize our strategy at sort of very highest level is lead by example. So we've said we will reduce our emissions very radically, we'll get them down by 80 to 95% by 2050. That's at the EU level, and the UK through the Climate Change Act has made similarly strong commitments and made them legally binding. And leadership by example is also how the EU itself sees them, as this quote from President Barroso shows. What's happened so far? Well, unfortunately, we haven't succeeded. So the third line on this graph, the blue line in the middle, is the IEA's take, the International Energy Agency's take on where we're headed based on what has been achieved in terms of international agreement. So if you look at what was the pledges that were made at Copenhagen that were somewhat backed up at Cancun, and if you interpret those in a sort of reasonable way, given that they're all very vague, and add them all up, the IEA believes that that gives you what they call a new policy scenario, and that new policy scenario isn't at all consistent with emissions peaking in 2020. It has emissions rising, and it's consistent with a warming of 3.5 degrees centigrade. Now, given that the pledges were a bit vague, you can argue exactly about the numbers, but I think it's very hard to argue that we should have any confidence that we're not headed towards something which is much more than 2 degrees. So I don't think we could really argue that leadership by example has succeeded, because what really happened is that we turned up at Copenhagen with a sort of fantastic policy package, we being the EU, as a sort of shiny example, but the real debate was between China and the United States, and neither of them, I think, was terribly interested in what we were doing, and neither of them chose to follow our example. Not that they do nothing, but that what they have committed to do is much less than what they need to do. And in the case of the United States, any commitments are very hard to implement for domestic reasons, domestic political reasons. And to make things worse, we're actually shooting ahead. So what we have here is 2010 emissions. These were published recently. They are higher than people expected. And in terms of reaching our 2020 goals, well, if you look at the power sector, which is one big chunk of it, 80% of the power sector's emissions are already built in for 2020, because the power stations are there, or they're being built. As everyone knows, China is building enormous amounts of fossil fueled generation as well as other kinds. So leadership by example hasn't worked so far. What should we do about it? My sense is that at sort of Brussels level, and probably really around here as well, we're not really facing up to that. There is an element of wishful thinking and a belief that we should just do more of the same, and eventually the world will choose to follow our example. So the prime example of that is the proposal that Simon mentioned, the proposals to increase our target, our EU target to 25 or 30%. And I'm afraid my take on that, and it's the take of pretty much everyone who I talk to who's in the kind of international emissions world, is that the rest of the world won't be very interested. They won't. They will think it's a bad idea, they just won't really care whether we do 20% or 30%. So in terms of influence and leverage, I don't believe that it would make very much difference. And as a matter of emissions reduction itself, well, we're not that big as part of the world, so this is a well-known sort of statistic, factoid if you like. An extra 10% reduction by the EU in 2020 is the equivalent of 2 weeks of China's 2020 emissions. So should we do it? Well, if we should do it, it's for leverage, not because it's a big deal in itself, but I don't believe that it will give us that leverage. So what should we do instead? Should we give up? Absolutely not. It's not kind of time to open the champagne on the Titanic. But we should rethink our policy, I believe. Leadership by example isn't enough. So the report that Simon very kindly plugged goes into sort of some detail on what I think we should do. What I'm going to do today is just talk more briefly about what I think the implications are for 2020 targets and for the EU policies. So what's the sort of basis for all this? Well, I think we should accept that leading by example hasn't worked. Okay. I think we're very unlikely to get a binding, ambitious global agreement in the short term or in the medium term. and we're very unlikely to restrict warming to 2 degrees centigrade. Those are very sort of harsh and negative facts, but I think they're realistic. So what should we do as a result of that? I think we need to refocus our climate policy, and there are 2 elements to this. First is in terms of mitigation. So instead of saying mitigation or emissions reduction should just be focused on reducing our own emissions, being very good, and having the rest of the world follow us, we need to do things that will make it more attractive for the rest of the world to follow us. And that means really focusing on bringing down the cost of emissions reduction for other people, not just for ourselves. So David has just described some analysis, which I know is very good analysis, about how we can bring down the cost of offshore wind, for example, for the UK. But I don't think that's really the point, because what we really want to do is find ways to make it cheaper for China, India, etc., to reduce the costs to them of reducing emissions, to reduce the costs of low carbon generation. And those aren't really the same thing. So we might optimize the supply chain for offshore wind in the UK, and that would be a great thing for us in terms of our own costs. But it won't have a big impact on what happens in the rest of the world. And if we want the rest of the world to follow us, we have to think much more about that. So my high-level message is that we have to choose investments which are focused on the right technologies. That's the technologies that are most important to other countries, and that focus on innovation and bringing down the costs of those technologies. There's a second part about adaptation, which I'm not going to talk about today, but I also think it's clear that we ought to, when we think about adaptation and damage limitation, we should be realistic about the level of warming that we're likely to see. So what does this mean for our targets and our policies? Well, I think I've already said some of this. The way we think now isn't looking at technologies from a global perspective, it's looking at them from an EU perspective or a UK perspective. We're too focused on renewable energy, and we're too focused on 2020. I'll come back to that. We're not focused on innovation and cost reduction because we're too focused on 2020. And as a result, let's say we're investing in the wrong technologies. We're too focused on deployment. We're not enough focused on innovation. So let me give some examples. First of all is CCS. So CCS is an incredibly important technology globally. So if you think about the UK and our 2020 and 2050 targets, CCS has value, it's part of the portfolio, and all the things that David said were sensible and true. If you step back globally, I think CCS is potentially much more important, right? So globally, China, the United States, a lot of other countries have huge reserves of coal. Is it likely that they're not going to burn them? I think that's pretty unlikely. We ourselves, one of DEC's goals is to exploit all oil and gas that's economically viable in the North Sea. So why would we expect other people not to use their fossil fuels? I think it's unlikely. So CCS is really crucial in the sense that if you don't have CCS, then it's very hard to imagine how you would have a world with low emissions, because people will burn their coal and will burn their gas. It's also really important because you can use it not only for power generation, but also for industrial processes like cement and refining, which don't have very good other solutions. And it's also hugely important in terms of costs. So David has touched on this. The IEA's view is that the costs of meeting emissions goals goes up by 70% if you don't have CCS available. So CCS is a really important technology. Having said that, it's also an uncertain technology. It needs to be proven. We need to find out whether it can really be made to work at scale or not. And what does that take? At the moment, what it takes is large amounts of RD&D. And then we come on to what does it mean for our policies? Well, it's not that our policies take no interest, but we don't take enough interest in CCS. It gets less ambition, it gets less political attention, and it gets much less money than other things which I think are of less value. So as an example of how we would do things differently, I would say focusing much more on CCS and on RD&D and innovation in CCS is clearly something that we ought to do if we want to persuade the rest of the world to follow us. And it's not something which follows from 2020 targets and a 2020 renewables target. Solar PV, again, is a hugely important technology on a global scale. It's not very important for the UK, really. It's unlikely. It's not a very sunny place. You get 2.5 times more sunshine in North Africa than you do here, so it's unlikely that it would ever make sense to have a lot of solar PV in the UK. But globally, it has enormous potential. It's also very costly. So again, it's something where we ought to devote a lot of attention if we have a global interest. The attention ought to be focused on innovation, on RD&D, and the value of spending enormous amounts of money on putting solar PV in place now is much lower. That's something which Spain and Germany are spending extraordinary amounts of money on. They want to meet 2020 targets. They have a big ambitions for renewables per se, but those aren't policies which are focused or which are likely to help achieve global action, get global leverage. And last example, offshore wind, which again David has spoken about. It's much less important as a technology at a global level. Okay, it's very important for the UK, and people often say, well, we should invest in it because we're uniquely blessed with this resource. My take on that would be the opposite, that if we're uniquely blessed with it, then we shouldn't really worry about it too much, because no one else can follow us if they don't have that resource. Now that's an exaggeration, because other people do have some resources, but offshore wind has much less technical potential, certainly, than the other two. And why are we spending so much money on it so quickly? I think David's already given the answer, really, which is that we're trying to meet a target which is not a rational target, and it would be better to slow down, spend less on it, and certainly wait until it's less expensive. So what does that tell us overall for the 2020 renewables target? I think this is really what I've already said. It's leading to excessive and premature deployment of immature technologies in the wrong places. It distorts investment away from innovation and from long-term R&D. It's distorting the choice between nuclear, CCS, and renewables. The other arguments for renewables, which you hear a lot in Brussels and to some extent here, I think are rather specious. So people say we should invest in renewables for security of supply. Renewables can help with security of supply, but so would nuclear and so would CCS, and in quite similar ways. They would all reduce our dependence on imported gas, for example. And the other question I would have is, if we import less gas because of renewables, is it Russian and Algerian gas that we import less of, or is it the LNG from safe and faraway places? And then the argument that you hear again a lot is, well, we should invest in renewables because of jobs and industrial policy and so on. I'm afraid that also is poor economics. As far as jobs and employment go, economists have a reasonable understanding of what affects the level of employment, and it's macroeconomic factors. It's about skills, it's about benefits, it's about minimum wages, it's about the availability of childcare, and there's no point at all in trying to design a renewables policy with the aim of creating jobs. So what are my conclusions? Leading by example isn't working. I think there's very little reason for us to adopt a 30% or 25% greenhouse gas emissions target by 2020. The rest of the world won't notice. I think instead we should refocus our policy. Plan B means focusing on innovation and on reducing costs. I think we do need a portfolio of technologies. When we choose how much to invest in each part of that portfolio, it's got to be about the global impact of the technology and about bringing down the cost of that technology. And lastly, we don't need the renewables target, which I think is distorting and inefficient.
Right, okay. You've had a couple of experts, you get a crude politician's view now. But I do welcome the fact we're having a debate about this today. It's very timely, very important. One of the things I think that is clear is that the decisions we take during the lifetime of this Parliament, between now and 2015, will shape Britain's energy infrastructure for quite a long time to come. So getting these decisions right has a huge reward and also quite a big penalty if we get it wrong. I do welcome the thesis in some of Policy Exchange's work that the focus should be on carbon reduction targets, not on renewables targets. I think that's the rational approach. It was one of the questions that was posed, what our aims of energy policy should be. I think there should be three absolutely overriding aims, and these are in order of priority. The first is to be as efficient as possible in the use of energy. That has to be right under all circumstances, whether you buy into any of the scientific arguments about climate change. The second is to cut greenhouse gas emissions from electricity production, and the third is to achieve greater security of energy supplies. Achieving those aims would preserve, indeed might improve our economic competitiveness in the medium term. It would certainly accelerate investment in low carbon buildings, low carbon infrastructure, low carbon power generation. And if the coalition was to add to its goal of being the greenest government ever, the aim of making Britain the most energy efficient country in the world, it will be doing the right thing environmentally and also the right thing economically. And I hope that the Green Deal whose concept is certainly right, but whose details remain, even 2/3 of the way through the Standing Committee on the Energy Bill, quite obscure. I believe the Green Deal could represent the largest ever single step change in the energy efficiency of Britain's homes, and if extended to the rest of the building stock, it might have quite a material impact, not only on energy costs but also on carbon emissions. I should incidentally declare an interest which is registered in the times we live in. I don't dare address any meeting without doing this. My interest as the chairman and option holder in 2 renewable energy companies, one quoted, one not quoted, one developing an alkaline fuel cell for electricity production in static applications, and the other developing a second generation biofuel. As I said, I support the policy exchange thesis that a target for renewables, particularly a challenging one, as opposed to a target for carbon emissions, does run the risk of raising energy prices unnecessarily. It may divert too much investment into expensive renewable energy sources, which may also suffer the problems of being intermittent. And offshore wind, of course, is the prime example. The costs have already been mentioned by both David and Bert. I also warmly welcome, as I have done before, the Climate Change Committee's focus on the pathway to a very, very substantial cut in carbon emissions from electricity generation by 2030. Is it 50 grams per kilowatt hour? Yes, okay. That has to be the right way to concentrate on our minds on what needs to be done. And of course we can track the progress to it year by year. For that reason, I do have rather more sympathy with the government's support for a tougher EU target for carbon emissions reductions by 2020. I can see that leadership by example doesn't cut much ice in the hard-headed world of international climate negotiations, but I wouldn't underestimate the potential for the EU, with just over 500 million people, about 30% of world GDP, to be an influence. The truth is that if the EU was capable of acting in a united way, and there's increasing evidence that will never happen, but if it was, we could be able to sit at the top table with the US and China, if we chose. And I think there's an interesting potential axis between China and the EU on climate change issues. I really do believe that the Chinese are now very focused on decarbonising their economy in a way that certainly was not true 10 years ago. I think the danger for those of us in the West, we may wake up one day in 2030, the equivalent of Cancun or Copenhagen, the COP meeting of 2030, COP 417, what it will be like. And suddenly the Chinese are frightfully sorry, chaps, we got it wrong all those years ago. We now accept what you were telling us back in 2010. We do need a world where global greenhouse gas emissions are vastly lower, and we're going to have the equivalent of a nuclear non-proliferation treaty applying to electricity generation. Emissions from generating plant will be capable of being monitored externally, and if the world's future, the conditions of climate stability in which the human species has become uniquely successful in the last few thousand years, if those conditions are threatened, we might suddenly find that there was a legally enforceable international treaty. And those countries which have ignored the opportunity to decarbonise their economies might then be placed at the most enormous disadvantage. And I think that if the EU and China could get together, we might find the Americans would have to follow. I was, however, struck, I've always quoted Chai En-lai as saying, an example of how long-term the Chinese think by saying, when he was asked what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said it's much too early to tell. I read in the paper the other day that this was a mistake in translation. He was actually talking about the 1968 riots in Paris, but be that as it may. I think that the EU, by setting a tougher target for carbon emissions reductions, would drive faster investment in low-carbon buildings, low-carbon transport systems. It would drive more innovation in low-carbon technology right across the whole range of industry. Incidentally, I do think it's impossible to detach energy policy completely from some other areas of policy. You've got to think about things like transport policy, because the contribution towards reducing demand for energy, reducing carbon emissions in transport is so great. That's why I'm a passionate supporter of high-speed 2, not only because of the modal shift from domestic flights onto railways, which it could achieve, but also because of the capacity it releases on the existing railway lines, which would transform the opportunities for commuters both in the West Midlands and the North West and in London. You could even make a climate change case for the third runway at Heathrow. if you recognise that a vast amount of aircraft emissions result from stacking as you're trying to queue to land. And actually a third runway, if it was not used just to increase the number of flights, but to smooth the arrival and departure of the existing flights, would then actually produce a significant cut in emissions. Anyway, coming back to energy policy, I won't get onto road pricing, which of course is the single biggest way to cut emissions from transport and also to reduce congestion. But courtesy of the Daily Mail will never be introduced into this country. Returning to energy policy, I'd just like to quote from the report my committee produced last month on electricity market reform. We said, and I quote, "We recognise that having a renewables target does little to contribute to European carbon reduction goals in the short term. Aiming for a certain level of renewable generation is an expensive way of achieving decarbonisation of the electricity sector." Of course, there's no question, in the short term, the cheapest way to cut emissions dramatically from electricity generation is to have a new dash for gas. And that will get us through the 20-teens rather successfully. But it won't get us to where we need to be in 2030 unless we have carbon capture and storage. There is a huge prize if we can make CCS work viably for coal and gas. A really huge prize, not just in this country, but internationally. But I can't be all that optimistic given the size of the prize, given the fact that the government is offering £1 billion for a competition to try and develop this technology. There's now only one entrant in that competition. If the chances of making this work viably and quickly were really good, people would be falling over themselves to take part in this competition, but they won't. So I suspect those who know much more about it than I do think this is really quite a challenging technology to achieve. If we can do it, most of our problems are solved. But it's a huge gamble to say, okay, we're going to rely on that. And if we had a huge dash for gas in the short term, it would, as I say, it would get us to 2020 in rather a good place, but it might get us to 2030 with a lot of stranded assets, which then would not be usable because we haven't managed to make gas, CCS work with gas. So what we do need is a range of technology-blind incentives for all kinds of low-carbon generation. And that's got to include nuclear. We must face up to the fact that whatever the difficult relationships there are in the coalition and the fact that a large number of members of the coalition government have pledged to be opposed to nuclear power, the fact is we cannot get through the next 30 or 40 years without a substantial element of nuclear power. It is cheap, it can provide base load. The new power stations are fundamentally different from the one in Japan, and of course the conditions in the UK are also fundamentally different from that in Japan. I warmly welcome the very sensible report by Mike Wakeman, which was published a couple of weeks ago, about the aftermath of the Japanese accident. We do need nuclear. Another low carbon form of generation which we also need, which so far has scarcely been mentioned today, and it's so revealing of the fact that we always ignore this, is waste to energy. There's a huge potential with all sorts of innovative technologies to produce electricity from waste. Because of this obsession we have with recycling, we don't think of waste as a renewable source. Every economy in the world will produce a certain amount of waste which cannot be recycled. So if we can use that to create energy, that is a genuinely renewable source which should be entitled to exactly the same incentive regime as other low carbon sources, provided it is of course a low carbon waste source. Now, with that in the background, I believe there's also a possible role for regulation in the form of emissions performance standards. If they are set on a timescale which respects the investment cycle of the industries concerned, they do not necessarily harm those industries. And if they're set well in advance and applied consistently, and of course there is a real danger that the suspicion of investors is that policies will change when there's a change of government, and that already raises the cost of capital quite substantially. But if we had gradually tightening emissions performance standards through the 2020s for fossil fuel generation, we might find that we were having a more logical choice between coal and gas and the alternatives. There could of course still be a role for some high emission plants to operate in times of peak demand or national emergency, and appropriate payments could be made to maintain that plant potentially in operation. My last point is about price. I recognise in the short term that greener and more secure electricity costs more than just burning lots of coal and gas. Inevitably it does. But as the low carbon alternatives scale up, their costs could fall dramatically. And if global concern about climate change intensifies, and if we do find that eventually emissions trading does spread, and it's interesting that Chinese are now talking about experimenting with emissions trading in China, if emissions trading spread, then we might find that those countries which have diversified and decarbonised their energy industry might be better off economically as well as environmentally. Better off than those countries which continue to rely in the 2020s and 2030s on fossil fuels, which in many countries will be largely imported, whose price they can't control and whose use may turn out to be much more expensive. So, a range of scenarios, a range of possible solutions. None of them are guaranteed to be successful, and for that reason I believe we need a portfolio approach with a wide range of energy sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for 3 stimulating presentations, and we've got plenty of time for some Q&A. I think we'll probably definitely take questions in batches of 2 or 3. And in the first batch, I'm going to use Chairman's prerogative to add one of my own. So I'll start with that one, which is a question for David. So the question is, if instead of your current objective in terms of the duties of the Committee on Climate Change, you had a different one, would you come out with a different proposal? And the difference that I'm thinking of is your objective is currently how to advise the government on how to meet the Climate Change Act 2050 target ultimately, to set carbon budgets along the way. So it's a UK-focused target. If instead your objective was to advise the government on how the UK can have the biggest impact on global climate mitigation, would you make the same recommendations? For example, would you recommend such a high proportion of offshore wind? I'll take a couple more and then we'll come back to the panel. Stephen?
Thank you. I'm Stephen Tyndale from the Centre for European Reform, and it's partly related to that. The abandonment of the EU renewables energy targets, arguably good, but arguably not good. Also very unlikely to happen, given particularly Angela Merkel's recent U-turn, second U-turn on nuclear. So if the Renewables Directive remains and the targets remains, is it still plausible to meet the UK target, putting more emphasis on onshore wind rather than offshore wind? And particularly interested in Tim Year's view on whether the DEC approach of allowing local government to sell renewable electricity, which is a great move, will that be enough to overcome the NIMBYs?
Hi, so I'm Rob Gross. I'm from Imperial College. I'm going to chuck in a quick little factoid, and then I'm going to make a couple of comments, and I'm going to ask a question which is more actually directed at you, Simon, or the kind of policy exchange, but it reflects upon some of the things from this morning. So factoid, 16.5 gigawatts of wind were installed in China in a single year, last year. Now I appreciate that they don't face some of the same issues and constraints that we suffer from here. But if we did that twice, we'd meet our renewables target. So I think policy exchange's approach to this, and this is a kind of narrative that's been developing through a number of reports, continued attention to the climate problem, very welcome in the focus of some of the stuff that we're getting from some of the other lobbies at the moment. And I think the focus on innovation is very welcome as well. But unfortunately, I think that what's mainly unwelcome is a kind of continued adherence to a kind of school of economic thought, which goes along the lines of technology neutral, plus carbon price, plus fund a little bit of money at R&D. And I have to say this feels a little bit like a kind of Groundhog Day situation, because we've been round this. We went round this with the renewables obligation when it was first in place. Energy Review 2002, the Stern Review with its 3 pillars, including support for deployment and technology development. And the reason for a portfolio approach and for a technologically specific approach, including the renewables target, are well known. Learning by doing, developing the supply chain, economies of scale, meeting investor needs. And investors tell us time and again they can invest on the back of something like a feed-in tariff, they can't invest on the back of a carbon target, and they probably won't invest on the back of a carbon price, or at least they need an awful lot of persuading. It's horses for courses. Barriers to energy efficiency aren't price barriers. I could go on. So my question is, I wondered whether Policy Exchange might consider putting together a report that pays rather more attention to a rather wider understanding of innovation, technology, and therefore the role of deployment that you have done today.
Okay, I think a lot of that goes to the heart also of Boaz's report, so maybe I'll ask Boaz to start off, that's okay, and then
I mean, first of all, on China, I think the obvious thing to say is that all the numbers in China are very big. China does have massive amounts of investment in wind and solar and so on. They also have massive amounts of investment in fossil fuels. China's a very complicated place. Like other places, it has politics. Some of the politics is about climate change and global air pollution as well, which they really care about. But also the politics is about keeping growth going and keeping the legitimacy of the party in place. And those things mean that you get an outcome which is not necessarily rational. So it's somewhere between doing what we'd like them to do and doing nothing. So no one would say China is doing nothing, but China isn't doing what we hope they would do. And I have to say that in a way, it's bad that they are doing something, because the fact they're doing something tells you they've got a policy they've worked out, which means it's less likely to change. So I take your number, I agree with that number, but I think I'm still would be worried and pessimistic. The sort of general point, I agree, and I hope that I don't come across as being, you just need a carbon price and a bit of R&D. But I think that when you choose which technologies to invest in, you need criteria which are neutral, and you don't choose renewables over others on grounds which I think are really kind of emotional and warm and fuzzy. I don't think that we've said we should focus on renewables rather than nuclear or CCS on the basis of a good technology assessment. I think it's been a belief in renewables which has complex cultural grounds, but I don't think that it's really based on economics or technology.
So Simon, thank you for that question. I have to say, I'm so busy thinking about our current mandate, I haven't really gone into if we had a totally different mandate, how would we meet that one? And just take a step back. I don't think the Climate Change Act is just about diplomacy. It's not just about the UK leading the rest of the world. It is based on a presumption that we will be in a carbon-constrained world sooner or later. And it is about what does it make sense to do here in the UK in terms of minimising the costs associated with living in a low-carbon world, so maximising growth in a low-carbon world. And that is what we're thinking about. That's what the carbon budgets are about. That's what our recommendations on renewables are about. We're not saying develop a portfolio of low-carbon power technologies which we can then benevolently give to the world. We've suggested it makes sense to develop that portfolio in order to be able to decarbonise the UK economy in a world which will be carbon constrained. I don't disagree there is a diplomatic element to it, and David Miliband, obviously, who developed the Climate Change Bill, which became the Climate Change Act, was thinking about the UK making a legal commitment, a world first, and everyone else would follow. And I think I agree that the experience is, well, the grandstanding of the UK in Europe is not very effective in the context of getting a global deal where China and America are the key players, and they don't care if we have a 20% or a 30% target. But the people who are closer to the international stuff than I am, and so Nick Stern, for example, Nick has said to me the best thing we can do here in the UK is, yeah, set ambitious targets, but let's show how we can meet those targets. That's the key thing. We haven't been very good at that in this country. We haven't been very good anywhere in the world at actually getting emissions down. We've set targets and really done nothing. That's the message that's come from our progress reports. So again, I think what we can do in that diplomatic context is get our emissions down through the full range of options. What does that mean for technology policy? If we're trying to find technologies that both help us reduce emissions here, but also could help other countries, I think what we've got to do is look for an overlap between technologies that are both useful here and useful in other countries. And that has taken us to say, well, we should be developing electric vehicles, we should be developing nuclear power, CCS. I think we are doing things like CCS, so not as quickly as we might like here. And within that approach, well, offshore wind makes a lot of sense to have here in the UK just for our decarbonisation path, and does have applications in other countries as well. So if you look at 2020, we only account for a small proportion, for example, of the planned investment over the next decade across Europe. We're about 20% of that planned investment in 2020. So I think what we're doing is broadly sensible. If we had a different mandate, well, what can we do in the context of getting the world on the path to reduce emissions? I think we can build a low carbon economy, and we can do it at least cost, and what we've suggested is around building a low carbon economy at least cost. So I don't think we have radically different. I think if we went beyond our mandate and said, well, should we rip up the European renewable energy target for 2020? I think on balance that's been a good thing, in the sense if we didn't have it, we wouldn't have made progress on renewable heat, which is going to be very important here in this country, and it has got us focused on renewable power generation in a way that we weren't 3 and 4 and 5 years ago. Is the target possibly too ambitious? Should it be set in stone at 15% for us, 20% for Europe? Should it have no flexibility, whatever the cost? I think you can ask questions around that. And we've said, if you didn't have that target, then you might change the offshore wind ambition a bit. But going back to demonstrating to other countries, is the offshore wind element of our strategy over the next 10 years and possibly 20, is that going to undermine our demonstration value to other countries? I certainly don't think that's the case. I don't think it takes the cost so high that everybody else is going to say we cannot decarbonise anymore. So I think broadly we are on the right track under the current mandate. I don't think it would change radically under a different mandate, and I think what we can do is develop technologies, decarbonise our economy, show that it can be done at pretty low cost, which it can even with renewables in the mix.
On the question about renewables targets, I don't think the target is particularly harmful, except it runs the risk of distorting the market, because we don't offer comparable incentives for non-renewable but equally low carbon sources, and that's really where the danger is. I think just specifically on onshore wind, which could make a very big contribution to this country, I'm staggered that we don't make a more proactive marketing effort with onshore wind. It's left to individual developers for the most part to make applications. They're nearly always incredibly controversial. I've got one in my constituency right now, and needless to say, it comes from BT. I'm on the side of the opponents campaigning rigorously against these turbines in a particularly beautiful part of my constituency. But there clearly are plenty of locations in the UK where onshore wind is acceptable. Well, you laugh, but it is true. Onshore wind is acceptable, and of course there are ways of making it more acceptable by pricing the electricity it generates to the community affected at a huge discount. And I think we should be much more imaginative about that. We're simply not going to get the road. I mean, the local authorities selling renewable energy, it's a good idea, but not even near sufficient to get us where we need to be. And I do think a much more imaginative approach on planning issues and above all pricing issues in terms of allowing communities which may feel they've been they're paying part of the cost environmentally by the presence of wind turbines. If suddenly you found that the cost of your electricity bill is going down by 75%, you might think, well, I didn't mind that turbine at the end of my garden.
Okay, take 3 more questions. Kate, you're at the front. Yes, gentleman. And Kate back.
Question really for Boaz. Thanks very much for your presentation.
Can't hear that.
Is that better? Yeah. RD&D. I'm just looking through the report, and just to quote something you say on it. Much greater focus on RD&D, and you explain some of the technologies you think are most promising in that respect. Support should be provided on the basis of an evidence-based assessment process applied on a neutral basis to the whole range of low-carbon solutions. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you see the governance of that process. Is it the government that does it? Do you see another independent body perhaps taking on that task? And I think, David, you've very recently reported on innovation as well, so you might have some thoughts on that.
Simpson. I'm a covering politician, currently working with Energy Advisors Friends of the Earth. I just want to try to run some of the comments past a different audit pace, which is the way in which the feedback I'm getting from discussions with some of the investment bankers who have vested interest in where they put their money in future energy policies. And I run some of these ideas past them, and they said, well, they're detailed, but as we suspect that a lot of detailed discussions went on in France when they were considering building the Maginot Line. And these may be just about as relevant, because the question for them about where they will put their money is starkly at odds with the sort of comments that are coming from the panel. The first one that they say is anywhere but nuclear. We're not going to be in that. You can be there if you like, but we're not. CCS outside the UK is regarded with great scepticism because of precisely the comments that Tim made, that if you put up a £1 billion fund and you get no bidders for a competition, there are real doubts about whether it will deliver. And the other comment that comes in is, why does the UK not address the wretched nature of the current energy market, which is one of the most closed in Europe, it is anti-competitive, and it fails to deliver any of the benefits specifically being experienced in Germany, where energy prices are lower than they were at the start of the economic crisis, as low as they were 5 years ago, and because the merit order effects of giving priority of access to system to renewables and much more commonality of ownership and competition within the process develops a completely different culture. With Germany just having passed the 100,000 jobs barrier in solar, I just find it bizarre that the UK consistently says we just detach ourselves from the notion of employments, green jobs for the future, and economic security as well as energy security. So maybe my question to the panel is, if a plan A is not enough, and if a plan B is not really relevant, is anyone interested in a plan C, which would just be given from saying, let's just ask the Germans?
Energy prices or electricity prices?
Electricity prices.
Electricity, thank you.
Just a quick question. Roger Salomon, sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah. Sorry, Roger Salomon from EEF, the Manufacturers Organisation. David mentioned the potential public acceptability issue around nuclear in 2020. I was wondering if the panel also see the risk of public acceptability issue around costs if we power ahead with Plan A, that could morph into a backlash against what is gladly widespread support for climate policy at the moment.
Thank you. Shall we take the panel in the opposite order?
Okay. On that last point, I think public support for action on climate change has already diminished very substantially. I think as a result of the recession and various other, there's a degree of climate change fatigue around. And one of the challenges, I think, for those of us who believe very strongly in the risks if we don't take early action, is to start reselling the idea with an element of hope in it. There's got to be some good news in this story, and there's a danger it's all apocalyptic. And I think that to say to people, here's a chance, once again, for Britain to lead the world, a new industrial revolution, a lot of technologies, we're very resourceful. There's got to be a sense that this is actually somewhere where we want to go to, not where we're being forced to go to, even though I believe we are going to be forced to go there. I think on Alan's point, he makes a very, very powerful point about in a global investment market, why would you, if you're looking to invest in electricity generation, come to the UK? There are lots of good reasons why you would not. The policy regime is not sufficiently stable and predictable. The tax regime is actually quite hostile. The personal tax regime, Alan and I won't agree on this, I think is very hostile as well. If I was advising someone in their early 20s where to go, you wouldn't think, why would you try and make your fortune in the UK with 50% tax rate? You'd be crazy to go here. And the same is true, I think, for a lot of energy investments. People will be reluctant to come to this country where the returns are so uncertain. That's one of the challenges which we haven't really taken much account of in all the debates about EMR. What I absolutely agree with Alan is that the retail market is not at all a good competitive market. The evidence that the companies which dominate that market can move prices up when they want to, the process of switching is certainly beyond the reach of anyone who's busy, and probably beyond the reach of many of the fuel poor. And actually, the result of that is that we are paying too much for electricity, and the companies are getting away with operating in near monopoly conditions.
Okay. I think for us, Plan A is decarbonise the power sector in the context of wider economy decarbonisation. And do you need a Plan B there? I think no. If you can't decarbonise the power sector, it's not obvious what you would do instead. It's not that you would suddenly decarbonise agriculture, for example. So Plan A has to stay in that sense. Now, I don't think we have a Plan A in terms of how will we decarbonise the power sector. So we are setting out to develop a whole range of options, be it nuclear, CCS or renewables. And I don't think anyone's saying at this stage the precise balance between those technologies to achieve decarbonisation, certainly beyond 2020, and even more so as you get beyond 2030. And we gave an illustrative scenario of how you could decarbonise the power sector to 2030 with a mix which was 40% nuclear, 40% renewables, 15% CCS, and 5% residual unabated gas-fired generation. But we were very clear that it makes no sense now to say that is what we should aim to achieve in 2030. We'll find that out, and we'll know more about costs, we'll know more about deployability over the next decade. Now, whether people would want to invest in nuclear in the UK, well, I think at the moment, would you want to put nuclear into our current market arrangements? The answer is no. We've been very clear on that over the last 2 or 3 years. I think it comes down to if we get the right electricity market arrangements in place. And I think that also feeds through to investment decisions in CCS. And I think we shouldn't be too pessimistic in the sense, the one demonstration project that we're nearing close on at the moment, so Longanet, it's been around years, it's been delayed for years, but there is a second set of projects, and there's a lot of interest in those projects. And if you look at, for example, the applications for European funding for CCS, most of those came from the UK. So I think 4 of the 7 or 8 applications at the European level came from the UK. We're very active on CCS. There's a lot of interest here. Now that may dwindle if we can't get the second competition or set of competitions moving more quickly, and so investors will go to other countries where they are moving forward more quickly. China, for example, plenty of other examples where there is activity on CCS. But again, we've got an opportunity to get it right on CCS and do that in the context of new electricity market arrangements. And I think that's the big test. If we can get those arrangements in place, then we can compete for capital with the rest of Europe. But that's an open question at the moment. Now, do I think there's a public acceptability issue on electricity prices? I mean, obviously there is. There must be a limit to how high you can put the electricity price. We haven't said, well, does the renewables obligation take you beyond that limit? We've said the costs associated with the renewables obligation, and particularly offshore wind, are £50 a household, and we can leave that to politicians like Tim to decide, well, is £50 too much, and if it's too much, well, should we do something different? We just wanted to put the fact out there and let somebody else make the judgment. On governance for innovation, we did do a review on that. I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question in any detail, in the sense we said that from a governance perspective, it wasn't clear what the objective here in the UK is in terms of innovation. So we've got a lot of activity, a lot of bodies, all doing different things, not in a joined-up way, and there isn't an overarching goal and there isn't an overarching strategy, and that's what we need. And your institutional infrastructure, whatever it is less important than just having a clear what is it we're trying to achieve, first of all, and that's what we need. And I think once we've got the objective, we can think about, well, what is the best way then to achieve it?
Thank you. So on governance, I think I don't have a very strong answer, but I think if it's at UK level, I mean, these guys are quite a good starting point, actually, because if you look at the kind of assessments that they do and the quality of the work, they're obviously in the right ballpark. I think the more interesting question is, do you want it to be done at UK level or EU level? And my guess is that if you do it at EU level, it'll be done worse, but it'll be a better outcome, because we're talking about directing enormous amounts of money on investment. You really want to have that, you do want to have that coordinated. So my guess is that it should be done at EU level, despite the fact that I'm sure David would do a better job. CCS, I mean, I hope I didn't give the impression that CCS is kind of the obvious winner. That's not the case at all. It's a very uncertain technology. It has a lot of problems. You know, I've worked with developers in continental Europe who do want to build CCS power plants. It's not that no one wants to do it, but clearly there are big uncertainties. I come back to the point that it's hard to imagine. There are many scenarios certainly which don't involve China, the United States, other places that have enormous reserves of coal, not using a large amount of black coal. So if you don't have CCS, it's much harder to have the outcome that we want. And is Germany the model? Well, I guess really the point of my report is it a model for how we achieve our own decarbonisation, or are we looking for a model for how to persuade other people to decarbonise, how to make it easier for them to decarbonise? If it was how do we get to be 100% carbon free, I'd say Germany is more likely to get there than anyone else because they have profound commitment to it, and they have apparently a political system that allows them to overcome some of the problems we've had. But in terms of being attractive to the rest of the world as a model to follow, that's not so clear to me. You might say look at France. France in the 1970s managed to decarbonise its power sector very quickly at low cost. I don't think that any country is the clear model.
Thank you. Should we take 3 more questions? Okay, David, Doug, and Michael.
David Odling on Gas UK. Seem to be 2 aspects which often don't really get the attention that is necessary, and it was true at the CBI's discussion yesterday. We've touched a little bit on one of them, nobody talks about the subsequent one. First and foremost, huge amounts of capital have got to be spent, simply enormous amounts of capital. Most of these technologies are capital intensive, money up front. Can it be financed? Can we actually raise the money? Secondly, even if we can we deliver? In other words, is there a supply chain which is big enough to do all of this? And if there's a restraint in the supply chain, I would point out, it's human beings. Human beings of an adequate technical competence to do all these things. The problem with capital intensity is it's resource intensity and therefore human intensity.
It's Doug Parr from Greenpeace. I've got a couple of comments about what I've heard today. Firstly, about the nature of targets. Because setting targets and then missing them is a really bad idea, whether you're talking about domestic policy, investment, or in fact demonstrations to the rest of the world. But so just a thought about targets. One is that firstly the renewables target for the UK isn't actually any larger than any of the other major countries in Europe. In fact, it's lower. And the advantage of targets is that it frames one's level of ambition and attempts to make it. Now, to make it to those targets. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because the politics of energy in the UK have been pretty sclerotic, just like a number of our innovation areas, actually, but that's another story. And that, in my experience, as someone who's been on this issue for about 20 years, it's the only thing that's really galvanised any attempt to do much about renewables in the UK has been the EU renewables target. And the time before that has been, frankly, pretty hopeless. So I speak up for targets if they're accompanied by positive actions and implementation policies that actually drive fulfilment. And in that context, let me just say something a little bit about offshore wind. Because the idea that it's only a UK resource, I don't think is well placed. The Chinese ambition on nuclear, and let's face it, they meet their targets with rather more regularity than we do. The Chinese ambition on offshore wind is to get 30 gigawatts by 2020. It's about, well over twice our ambition. Germany has just reinvigorated its target for offshore wind. In fact, there's increasing interest in the US because the east and west coast are both close to population centres. So offshore wind actually is something that's of considerable interest to other Japan as well. Mitsubishi are over here, being a Japanese company, they're interested in offshore too. So if I were to come to the question, we've got some, in terms of tackling the politics of it, it's about changing the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground at the moment, which is influencing EMR, is that the utilities have got a lot of asset base they want to protect. So isn't there a role for targets in actually shifting the politics? So this is not about which technology and how we do it and what the costs are going to be, but about targets as expressions of political ambition in making change happen.
Thank you. My
Michael Grant, Cambridge University, and until fairly recently, Climate Change Committee changed when I joined Ofgem as a senior advisor part-time. Buyers and I were on a platform in Cambridge quite recently, presenting the book and the Climate Change Committee report respectively. And the conversation there really set me thinking about what drives the underlying differences. And I kind of want to suggest three reasons that come to, and your report for today. One, we shouldn't dwell on, and there's an element as to quite how seriously and deeply is one taking the climate problem and science. By and large, it's cumulative emissions which drive the atmospheric impact, and obviously a lot hinges upon quite how severely seriously we take mid-century targets and inertia. Leave that aside. The report's very clear. The other two are around learning, what we really believe about industrial investment and learning, including its international spillovers, where there's a bit of a debate about, well, in some areas the UK is a minnow and what it does is irrelevant to global learning. In other areas, if we're the only ones doing it, what's the point? I actually think offshore wind is an interesting halfway house. Not the only one doing it, but what the UK does will have a material impact on global development. But I think the biggest one, which I hear least about in any of these reports, or in the report launched today, is the difference between making a best guess central scenario in which we try and minimise the costs, which inevitably means building a hell of a lot of whatever you think is cheapest based on your best guess, in this case. Or are we in an uncertain world where there are lots of risks and feedbacks and options, etc.? And it's that I really think we need more attention on. Climate Change Committee, David referred to £50 per household for the targets. That is true. On the central gas scenario, and assuming that the price of gas is totally unaffected by the amount of renewables, the other way, the default scenario involves the UK having 80% gas. The difference between DEC's high, low and medium gas price scenarios is a hell of a lot bigger than £50 per household, by an order of magnitude at least. So, are we in a world where we're confident about best guess and optimise everything around it, or where we try and develop diversified energy mix and portfolios with learning? I think that's a really fundamental issue on debate here.
Well, there's quite a lot there for you. Do you want to kick off?
So I'll go in reverse order on the questions. I agree about the importance of uncertainty. I think if you think about portfolio theory for any kind of uncertain situation, so let's say you're investing in shares, the price of any share could go up or could go down. So the rational investor has a portfolio of shares, and the difficult question for them is how do they weight them? How much of each share do they need to have? And similarly, all the technologies that we're interested in are uncertain. We do need to have a portfolio. The difficult question is how do we weight them? And I think my first observation is that there's no particular reason to say that the ones that we call renewable should be overweighted for that particular reason. They're not better or worse because they're renewable, and perhaps more important, they're very different from each other. Some of them are much more hopeful than others. Having said that, I think we should weight them on, as I've said, on a neutral basis based on criteria about how important are they for the world and how likely are we to do well in innovation in those technologies. Offshore wind, I know it's not only for the UK. My observation is just that it's less important probably for the world than solar PV or than CCS, and that it's very overweight in our portfolio, even though I think that it's slightly underweight in terms of overall performance. On targets, I just have a rather facile answer really, which is I agree that targets are a good way to get things done, but my observations would be, one, they need to be the right targets if possible, and two, although targets have got things going in the UK and in Europe, I come back to my central observation, which is that that hasn't affected the rest of the world. And final question, first question, I guess, is this, can all this investment be sustained? I think that's really a question of the sustainability of the underlying policies. So if investors believe these policies are here to stay, then they will invest. I think that the fundamental mismatch between what we're doing and what the world is doing might give investors pause to think as to whether these policies are really sustainable, whether 10 or 20 years from now, if we're on our virtuous path down towards zero carbon in 2050 and the rest of the world is shooting ahead, whether that's really a sustainable policy. So I think that having a policy which is more rational would also be a policy that's more sustainable and might give more confidence therefore to investors.
Boaz and Tim. Let me start the other way around. So could we do it? Now, when we advised the government on the appropriate level of the fourth carbon budget, we worked out what would the investment cost through the 2020s be of reaching a 60% cut in 90, or 60% cut in 2030 relative to 1990. And we estimated that would be £150 billion, so £15 billion every year. Now, is that a big number? Well, it's a very small proportion of total investment that we envisage in the UK through the 2020s. So in principle, you can get that financed. I agree with Boaz, it comes down to, well, have we got the set of arrangements in place that we make the UK an attractive investment destination? And I think the answer is in the power sector at the moment, no. For example, offshore wind, where we want 30 billion, if the government is to achieve its target, 30 billion of investment over the next 10 years. I think that the finance may be a binding constraint unless we resolve the uncertainties around electricity market arrangements very quickly. In terms of supply chain, again, we haven't got the supply chain at the moment to decarbonise the UK economy, so there's big questions about nuclear capability and skills. We haven't got the offshore wind supply chain, we haven't got people who can put solid wall insulation in, we haven't got a renewable heat supply chain. But there is scope to develop a supply chain in all of those areas if we put the policies in place, and we expect if you put the policies in place, then the supply chain will react. So it comes down to policies. Now, takes us on to targets, and I agree. Look, I think targets are very good at getting governments focused, and the targets here start with the carbon budgets, which is a target, and it cascades to, well, decarbonise the power sector, which is, without saying a grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour target, we have a target that is broadly agreed we should decarbonise the power sector over the next 2 decades. And I think having those targets has been very useful. It's transformed the way that the government and officials working for the government think about climate change, and I think we've moved on a lot in the last 2 or 3 years since we've had the carbon budgets and the other targets that follow. And I've said on balance, I think the European renewables target is a good thing, if a little bit ambitious at the margin, but it's better that we have it than not at all, because renewable technologies, both in power and heat, are going to be very important, and we need to think about those at the moment. I mean, Michael, I think I need to come back there. I think I agree with you that given all of the uncertainties, and as Boaz says, well, it just is a kind of no-brainer, we should be developing a whole set of options, not tying ourselves to one of them at the moment, and then over time, as we learn more, we will take our investment path in a certain direction, but at the moment the portfolio is the appropriate way to go.
On targets, I agree, targets have got an important role to play in stimulating action, both by governments and indeed by business and consumers. The danger is, of course, we have the wrong targets. We've seen that in the health service. You know, a target to see someone in A&E within 4 hours means that cure ambulance is outside till they come inside the point at which the 4 hours starts to be counted. And the danger with the renewables target is if it stimulates investment in more expensive low-carbon technologies, because the cheaper but non-renewable low-carbon technologies fall outside the target. So there's a danger in targets that they produce perverse consequences, but properly used they can be very, very beneficial. On the availability of the investment funds, the answer is there's no certainty at all that we're available. But the sums are absolutely enormous, not just in this country but worldwide. It's one of the reasons why we need, for the sake of Britain's economy, to make sure we are one of the more attractive rather than less attractive places for investment in the energy and particularly electricity generation industries. And there's no certainty, we've got no entitlement, there's no God-given guarantee that Britain's going to be the recipient of a lot of investment by companies that are operating in a lot of other markets. So that's a very, very important reminder. On the human resources, I mean, the adaptability of humans is almost infinite, but of course we may have some specific skill shortages already. In fact, we do have some already, and therefore there's some important lessons about training, retraining, about the kind of courses we're offering at university and so on, if we're going to anticipate the way in which our needs are going to evolve.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for this afternoon. There are, or should be, copies of both the recent policy exchange reports at the back, or if not, then ask someone on the policy exchange people. And it just leaves me to thank the 3 speakers for a very stimulating discussion this afternoon. Thank you.